In the sacrament of reconciliation, penance, or confession, we Catholics confess our sins to a priest, express contrition for them, and receive absolution, whereby we believe if any of our sins had been mortal sins, the sort that destroy the life of charity and the soul of the sinner, we're restored to the life of grace again by God and made able once more to live and act in a way pleasing to him. We Catholics know to confess our mortal sins in this sacrament. That's its primary purpose, after all. But we're also encouraged to confess our venial sins, those daily failings whereby we fall short of the fullness of charity by thought, word, act, or omission. In particular, here are those venial sins that come closest to mortal sins. For example, performing some evil in grave matter, but without deliberate consent of the will, or alternatively, deliberately subjecting ourselves to an occasion of sin we could have avoided, even if we don't go on to commit the sin itself, leading ourselves into temptation. But have you ever wondered whether or not you should confess your temptations in the sacrament of reconciliation? I'm Dr. Richard Bulzacchelli for Catholic Studies Academy, and in this video I'm going to answer that question. But before we get started, you could help us accomplish our mission if you just hit that thumbs up button, like and subscribe, get notified of future content, and share our content on social media. So, should you confess your temptations in the sacrament of reconciliation? Many people say you shouldn't. I actually disagree with this advice, or I should say, I think we ought to take a closer look at it. In part 2 of his excellent series on the sacrament of reconciliation, for example, Father William Nicholas cautions against confessing our temptations because the purpose of the sacrament of reconciliation is to provide a remedy for our sins, and being tempted isn't actually a sin. The temptation is something that happens to me. It's something done to me, not something I actually do. It's not a sin to be tempted. Father Nicholas isn't wrong. I'll put a link to his video in the description below. I should say further that in the main, I strongly recommend Father Nicholas's series, especially for those who've been away from confession for a long time and don't know how to return, or for those who want to become Catholic but see this particular sacrament as an insurmountable hurdle. So again, being tempted to sin isn't the same thing as committing a sin. We do want to be clear about that. In fact, this very issue comes up in the first letter of John in chapter 3, in a difficult to interpret passage where John says, and I translate somewhat freely here, "Little children, we should love neither intellectually as mere thought, nor in mere words by what we say, but in our acts, and thus in truth. In fact, this is how we'll know that we're of the truth, and how we'll reassure our hearts before him. Would our heart condemn us, God is greater than our heart, and he knows all things. So, beloved, if our heart can't actually condemn us, we have confidence before God, and whatever we might ask, we receive from him, because we keep his commandments, and we do the things pleasing in his eyes." In this passage, the term Cardia, heart, is a word used to describe the inner man, who I really am. It's an idea very closely connected to that of conscience, and it's sometimes translated that way. But it really indicates the true person in his deepest allegiances, as reflected in his ultimate values. Where a man's treasure is, that is where his heart will also be. So in this context, John is talking about a person's temptations. If we belong to God, we turn away from sin and live in righteousness. The problem is that this doesn't always mean that all prior attachment to sin is suddenly behind us. The same evils as before may still attract us. If you're anything like me, you know this perfectly well. And John notes that we judge ourselves by what attracts us because that's an indication of the inner man. If I'm tempted by this evil object, I must place some value in it. If I didn't value it, I wouldn't be attracted to it. Now here I'm speaking of the specific sort of temptations, mind you, that we experience in the context of our fallenness. The temptations experienced by the man and the woman in the garden prior to sin, or perhaps by the Virgin Mary, or certainly by our blessed Lord during his 40-day trial in the desert or in the context of his sacred passion, are temptations of a very different sort from those at issue here. I'm talking about those temptations that arise from that frustrating interplay between the darkened intellect and the disordered will that plague fallen humanity, what many Protestants call our sin nature. So the very fact that I find myself tempted in this kind of way already reveals a certain moral defect in me. Now, that's true, but in the end, even so, in this particular case, perhaps I didn't choose that object. Instead, I chose righteousness. I chose God. And that's the true indication of my heart in this concrete situation. As Karol Wojtyła, Pope John Paul II, would have said, my true values, my fundamental option for or against the good and God is revealed in what I actually do concretely here and now. It's revealed in my human acts, those acts that flow from my rational understanding and the free consent of my will. My heart condemns itself because deep down I know I shouldn't love these evil things at all that tempt me, and yet I do. But it can't really condemn me. I mean, convict me of having sinned, because in the end I loved God more than this other thing. I chose him. I didn't sin. So this is Father Nicholas's point, and I agree with him about that. But this is also why I disagree with Father Nicholas and others about whether or not this kind of temptation belongs in the confessional. Now, don't get me wrong. We don't have to confess every temptation. In fact, that would probably be impossible. And encouraging a person to keep track of all of his temptations would only foster deep-seated neuroticism. But when we find ourselves beleaguered by a powerful and persistent temptation, always feeling on the brink of giving in to it, that, I think, is something we should confess. Why? Not because merely having that temptation is an actual mortal sin, but because it tends toward mortal sin, and we want to avoid that sin. Once again, in Roman Catholic piety, that's one of the devotional applications of the sacrament of reconciliation, not only to heal mortal sin, for which the sacrament is understood to be necessary, but also to strengthen us against committing mortal sin in the first place. So, to repeat, a powerful and persistent temptation to a grave evil, even though it's not a mortal sin in itself, arises from a defect in our own moral and spiritual character that tends toward sin. It's safe to say that it's an expression of one of the so-called capital sins, and the hesitancy to do what we ought, the sluggishness of our response to God, the energy drained away from what we ought to be doing by my attraction to that evil thing, right, not put to work in a positive way for the things of God, does fall under the genus of venial sin. So if you're a devout Catholic and you've ever paid attention to the conditions for receiving a plenary indulgence, by which the Church teaches a person is freed even from the so-called temporal punishments due to sin and rendered thusly perfectly purified for heaven here and now, you'll have noticed that they include both going to confession and having no lingering attachment to one's sins. But these temptations, in being what they are, reveal a lingering attachment to sin, even in spite of the life of grace. Certainly pious reception of Holy Communion affords an effective remedy against this attachment, but wouldn't the sacrament of reconciliation do so as well, and from another front, and thus be all to the good? I think so. So, is it strictly necessary for my salvation that I confess my temptations? No, certainly not. Do I have to confess even those powerful and persistent temptations that reveal my moral defects and lingering attachment to sin? Again, no. Remember, in themselves, they're not mortal sins. But is it reasonable in the context of the sacrament of reconciliation to confess this kind of temptation? I think it is. Is it laudable and beneficial to me as a penitent? Well, when I've personally dealt with those sorts of things, I've found it to be so. Maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't, but those are my thoughts on the subject. I've told you what I think and why I think it. If you like this video, go ahead and hit that thumbs up button. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, ask for notifications, and share our content on social media. Doing so helps us reach a broader audience and hopefully lead more souls to heaven. Again, I'm Dr. Richard Bulzacchelli for Catholic Studies Academy. Thanks for watching.